Well, thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for the invitation and the possibility to present this project here. My name is Heidi Siller. This is my colleague Ruth Wager. We are from the University of Innsbruck. Well, I tend to speed up in presentations. So if I'm getting too fast, please just let me know. I'm trying to have less speed in my speech. The EU project we're presenting today is called Operationalizing Psychosocial Support in Crisis. We will give an overview of the project and also an overview of the first findings. The project is coordinated by the by the Reference Center of Psychosocial Support by Nana Wiedemann. And in total we have 11 partners. They come from the scientific area. They also come from the fields, and we also have technical staff to translate the findings we have into an internet-based platform. There is also a website from the project. It's opsic.eu/WordPress. So the project, or the aim of the OPSIC project, is to integrate all the existing knowledge on psychosocial support after crisis and to combine it in a comprehensive guideline. As we already heard yesterday several times, there are high-quality guidelines and handbooks out there on the international level as well as on the European level. And we will try to combine them into a comprehensive guideline to make them available or accessible for various groups, for example, for crisis managers, and to also provide tools that can be used in the various phases of crisis or disasters, the preparedness prevention phase, in the response to recovery phase, or also in the recovery to long-term phase. We're focusing in this project on various target groups, on helpers, on the general population, and specific target groups on such as older people, children, young people, people with disabilities. And we look at different phases, as I already mentioned before: prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and recovery to long-term. What we are trying to construct is an internet platform that contains a glossary. We also heard yesterday that a lot of terms out there on psychosocial support, disaster, crisis, and we're trying to give an overview how can these terms be defined, how they overlap, or how are they distinguished. We will give an overview on what guidelines and handbooks do exist on the international and on the European level. A toolbox that contains recommended tools that can be used in the various phases and with various target groups. And last but not least, a comprehensive guideline. So these are the main steps that we're busy with now. The University of Innsbruck is doing the mapping and analyzing of existing psychosocial support guidelines and handbooks. So we collected guidelines and handbooks on the international level and on the European level. We had a look, what do they cover, what areas do they cover, what phases do they cover, what target groups, also what events. The Amsterdam Medical Center is doing a best practice in psychosocial support assessment and intervention and developing indicators. And the University of Zagreb, who is also represented by Helena Batkic, who is sitting over there, is doing a review and meta-analysis on long-term impact of major incidents and disasters. We will translate these major tasks into a comprehensive guideline, and that should be translated into this internet-based platform called OGS. And the OGS will be pilot tested, of course. I will focus now only on the mapping and analyzing of existing guidelines. So what we have done is we searched various databases, we collected guidelines, handbooks, tools. We're still in the process of collecting tools. We analyzed and mapped them. What areas do they cover? What gaps do we find according to scientific criteria? We also selected recommended guidelines that are mentioned very often, and we will select recommended tools that can be used. In total, we found a bit more, or about 300 guidelines and handbooks. So a bit more on the international level, 218 international guidelines and handbooks for psychosocial support after crisis, and a bit less, 57, on the European level. Sorry?
Since you finished, there were more than since you finished.
Yeah, yes, we know. Hopefully. So what we provided so far is a linked list of guidelines and handbooks. So where can we find these guidelines and handbooks? What do they contain? And also on the European level, because they're often project related, in what projects were they developed, these guidelines and handbooks? And we tried to find how can we cluster or group those guidelines. We found that there are, I only refer now to the European guidelines and handbooks. We found that most European guidelines and handbooks refer to a general level, so to the general population and to all phases, but they focus on the response phase. But we also found guidelines and handbooks on the prevention phase, like an exercise guide, also on the long term, on various event types like CBRN, terrorist attacks. There are some out there for flooding, but mostly on the technical implications of flooding, what has to be done in a technical way, less on in a psychosocial support area, and on target groups. So we have children and young people, we have helpers, we have refugees. There is not a lot on older people and persons with disabilities. The persons with disabilities is highlighted here in red, because that would be the EUNAD project. And we're very happy that this gap will be closed with this project. We also found that there are specific topics covered by the guidelines and handbooks, such as communication, humanitarian assistance centers, identification, the resilience monitor, for example, schools, risk assessment. So there are various specific types that are also covered in the guidelines and handbooks. So what we found are the gaps in the European guidelines, especially on older people and persons with disabilities, but also gaps on gender, culture, ethical aspects, in the phases on long-term phases, and within the events on catastrophic events. So these are gaps that we're trying to fill with the knowledge from international guidelines and handbooks. And we're trying, or we will have a look, how can these international guidelines and handbooks translate it into the European context? Because in Europe, we also have specificities such as various languages, various cultures, and also what has also been mentioned yesterday, how things are done in each country. So how can we translate these international guidelines and handbooks into the European context? I will now come to the comprehensive guideline, because we are now starting, or just started, to begin the comprehensive guideline. And we had to make a structure for the comprehensive guideline, and we'll present this just in short. I have a picture here that looks quite complicated, and I won't go in there step by step, but just explain what we are trying to do with the comprehensive guideline. So the structure of the comprehensive guideline is based on other guidelines like the NATO 10s, the ISC, and other guidelines. And what we are trying to do is not to make a bigger guideline combining all the findings from all guidelines, so a never-ending story, but to cut the information down and produce action sheets. These action sheets are, for example, in the ISC. They contain main points what to do in what, for example, in what phase, for what target groups, and also contain recommended readings and recommended literature to deepen the knowledge. So we are trying to filter the information from existing guidelines into main points, but also give references to other guidelines. Where can you find further reading on specific target groups, for example? What we will do is produce these checklists on various levels and for various target groups, for the affected population, for young people, older people, persons with disabilities, where we also rely on EUNAD, staff and volunteers, and also split into various phases: prevention preparedness, response recovery, and recovery to long-term phase. At last, I would like to show what we're trying to do with the toolbox. So, as I mentioned before, we are now collecting the tools and also having a look what tools are mentioned in the guidelines and handbooks, because they often contain tools what can be done before, during, or after an event. And we're also trying to group it so it can be easily accessible. And we group it also for various target groups and various phases. So on the one side for the general population, what can be done in the prevention preparedness phase? What training materials, what kind of planning, assessment, but also in the response recovery phase, like PFA, psychological first aid, screening, monitoring, or in the recovery to long-term phase, what kind of evaluation exists, what tools are already out there that can be used in this phase. And we go down to specific target groups, just like children and young people, what can be done in the prevention preparedness phase, what training materials exist for this specific target group, what specific interventions exist for response recovery, or for long-term and for the long-term phase. Also for older people, persons with disabilities, and helpers. Yeah. So I think it has been mentioned quite a few times. There is a gap for interventions, for tools, for guidelines for people with disabilities. So we hope that there will be still, or will continue, a connection with the EUNAD project where we can exchange information and also produce these action sheets for our comprehensive guideline. So far, that was the overview on the Upstage project, and I would like to say thank you for your attention.